Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read-along of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope. I'm reading this book to you with copious interruptions on my part, as we just basically chat about the book while I'm reading it, although the chats have also overflowed into the comments and into my emails wonderfully, just wonderfully. I don't know why I have spent so much time on BookTube without constantly doing read-alouds, but I intend to rectify that. But we are at the end of this book. We are in the last 3 chapters, all of which begin with the words the last of something or other. As we wrap things up, one of the major plot lines of the book, the fate of Tretton Park, the fate of Montjoy Scarborough, has already been wrapped up in a very low-key way. But Montjoy Scarborough has a brother, Augustus Scarborough, his younger brother, who for much of the book is the legally expected heir to Tretton Park. He's only recently been redisinherited. And he's an oily, horrible, monstrous character. If young Harry Ainsley and young Florence Montjoy are our hero and heroine of the book, then Augustus Scarborough is certainly our villain. I would argue that that is true. I would argue that Trollope, the author, certainly means you to consider him to be leagues worse than the Jewish moneylenders, who are mainly lampooned for comic effect, I think. Whereas Augustus Scarborough is the real deal. And if we're going to be wrapping things up, we're going to want to find out about him. And that is this chapter, the last of Augustus Scarborough. When old Mr. Scarborough was dead and had been for a while buried, Augustus made his application in form to Mr. Grey and Mr. Barry. This is a reference to the fact that since Montjoy has been proven to be the legitimate heir, Tretton Park will go to him, all of it. And Augustus doesn't believe it. He doesn't want to let go. He says that if we don't share Tretton Park between us, then I'll sue, because I was the heir, and it doesn't matter. This second documentary evidence could be as false as the first one was. Only it's not Mr. Grey and Mr. Barry anymore. Mr. Grey is not dealing with the Scarborough family anymore. He had made it through his own attorney and had now received Mr. Barry's answer through the same attorney. The nature of the application had been in this wise, that Augustus Scarborough had been put into the position of the eldest son, that he did not himself in the least doubt that that was his true position, that close inquiry had been made at the time, and that the lawyers, including Mr. Grey and Mr. Barry, had assented to the statements as then made by old Mr. Scarborough, that he himself had gone to work to pay his brother's debts for the honor of the family, and had paid them partly out of his own immediate pocket, partly out of the estate, which was the same as his own property. That during his brother's abeyance, and in other words, the time period when his brother was not the heir, he had assisted in his maintenance, and on his brother's return had taken him into his own house. That then his father had died, and that this incredible news story had been told. Mr. Augustus Scarborough was in no way desirous of animadverting on his father's memory, but was forced to repeat his belief that he was his father's eldest son, and was, in fact, at that moment the legitimate owner of Tretton, in accordance with the existing contract. He did not wish to dispute his father's will, though his father's mental and bodily condition at the time of making of the will might perhaps enable him to do so with success. Good luck. Good luck finding a clearer mind than old Mr. Scarborough on the day of his death, on the very morning of his death. The will might be allowed to pass as valid, but the rights of primogeniture must be held sacred. Nevertheless, having his mother's memory in great honor, he felt himself ill-inclined to drag the family history before the public. Bit of Trollopian sarcasm there. Augustus Scarborough does not care about his mother's good name. For his mother's sake, he was open to a compromise. He would advise that the whole property, that which would pass under the entail, that which was intended to be left by the will, should be valued, and that the total should then be divided between them. If his brother chose to take the family mansion, it should be so. Augustus Scarborough had no desire to set himself over his brother. But if this offer were not accepted, he must at once go to law and prove that their niece marriage had been in fact the one marriage by which his father and mother had been joined together. So not Rummelsburg, just these. There was another proviso added to this offer, as the valuation and division of the property must take time. An income of at the rate of £200 a month should be allowed to Augustus till such a time as it could be completed. Such was the offer which Augustus had authorized his attorney to make. There had been some delay in getting Montjoy to consent to a reply. Before the offer had reached Mr. Barry, he was already at Monte Carlo with that ready money his father had left behind him. At every venture that he made, at least at every loss which he incurred, he told himself that it was altogether the doing of Florence Mountjoy. But he returned to England and consented to reply. He was the eldest son and meant to support that position both on his mother's behalf and on his own. As to his father's will made in his favor, he felt sure that his brother would not have the hardihood to dispute it. A man's bodily sufferings were no impediment to his making a will. Of mental incapacity he had never heard his father accused till the accusation was now made by his own son. He was, however, well aware that it should not be preferred. As to what his brother had done for himself, it was hardly worth his while to answer such an allegation. His memory carried him a little bit further back than the day on which his brother turned him out of his rooms. It's a pretty ugly scene that we saw. There were, however, many reasons, and this was put in at the suggestion of Mr. Barry, why he would not wish that his brother should be left penniless. If his brother would be willing to withdraw altogether from any lawsuit and would lend his cooperation to a speedy arrangement of the family matters, £1,000 a year, or £25,000, would be made over to him as a younger brother's portion. To this offer it would be necessary that a speedy reply should be given, and under such circumstances no temporary income need be supplied. So there's offer and counter-offer here. Mountjoy is offering to arrange a payment of £1,000 a year out of the estate. It was early in June when Augustus was sitting in his luxurious lodgings at Victoria Street contemplating this reply. His own lawyer had advised him to accept the offer, but he declared to himself a dozen times since his father's death that in this matter of the property he would either make a spoon or spoil a horn. And that does get an asterisk and a note from our editor, although you can tell what it is from context, all or nothing. And the lawyer was no friend of his own. He was a man who knew nothing of the facts of the case beyond what they were told to him, and nothing of the workings of his client's mind. Augustus had looked to him only for the law in the matter, and the lawyer had declared the law to be against his client. All that your father said about the niece marriage will go for nothing. It will be shown that he had an object. But there was certainly a marriage. No doubt there was some ceremony performed with an object. The second marriage cannot invalidate the first, though it may itself be altogether invalidated. The Rummelsburg marriage is and will be an established fact, and the Rummelsburg marriage, your brother was no doubt the issue. Accept the offer of an income. Of course we can come to terms as to the amount, and from your brother's character it is probable enough that he may increase it. Such had been his lawyer's advice, and Augustus was sitting there in his lodgings thinking about it. He was not a happy man as he sat there. In the first place, he owed a little money, and the debt had come upon him chiefly from his lavish expenditure in maintaining Mountjoy and Mountjoy's servant upon their travels. At that time he had thought that by lavish expenditure he might make Tretton certainly his own. He had not known his brother's character. He had not known his brother's character, and had thought that by such means he could keep him down, with his head well under water. His brother might take to drinking regularly at Monte Carlo or some other place, and might so die. Or he would surely gamble himself into further and utter ruin. At any rate, he would be well out of the way, and Augustus in his pride had been glad to feel that his brother was under his thumb. Just hates his brother and his father. Then the debt had been paid, with the object of saving the estate from litigation on the part of the creditors. That had been his one great mistake. He had then not known his father, or his father's guile, or his father's strength. Why had not his father died at once, as all the world had assured him was the case? Looking back, he could remember that the idea of paying the creditors had at first come from his father, simply as a vague idea. Oh, what a crafty rascal his father had been! And then he had allowed himself in his pride to insult his father, and had spoken of his father's coming death as a thing that was desirable. From that moment his father had plotted his ruin. He could see it all now. It's absolutely true. If he hadn't done that, all the rest of it, sure, old Mr. Scarborough said I don't expect him to like me. But openly wishing for his father's death, that's what did it. He was still minded to make the spoon, but he found that he should spoil the horn. Had there been anyone to assist him, he would still have persevered. He thought that he could have persevered with a lawyer who would really have taken up his case with interest. If Mountjoy could be made to drink, so as to die, he was still next in the entail, and he was his brother's heir, should his brother die without a will. And so he would if he took to the £25,000. But to accept so poor a modicum would go frightfully against the grain with him. He seemed to think that by taking the allowance he would bring back his brother to all the long-lived decencies of life. He would have to surrender altogether that feeling of conscious superiority which made it so much to him. Damn the fellow, he exclaimed to himself. I should not wonder if he were in that fellow's pay. The first fellow here was the lawyer, and the second was his brother. So he's thinking, they're all out to get me. When he had sat up alone for half an hour, he could not make up his mind. When all his debts were paid, he would not have much above £25,000. His father had absolutely extracted £5,000 from him towards paying his brother's debts. The money had been wanted immediately. Together with the sum coming from the new purchasers, father and son must each subscribe £5,000 to pay those Jews. Here that means moneylenders. So it had been represented to him, and he had borrowed the money to carry out his object. Had ever anyone been so swindled, so cruelly treated? Had ever anyone been so swindled, so cruelly treated? This might probably be explained, and the £5,000 might be added to the £25,000. But the explanation would be necessary, and all his pride would rebel against it. On that night, when by chance he had come across his brother, bleeding and still half drunk as he was about to enter his lodging, how completely under his thumb he had been. Interesting. So Augustus Scarborough was out wandering? It isn't that Montjoy went to his brother, it's that Augustus found Montjoy. And now he was offering him of his bounty this wretched pittance. £25,000. This is a wretched pittance. But then, with half-muttered curses, he execrated the names of his father, his brother, of Gray, of Barry, of his own lawyer. At that moment the door was opened, and his bosom friend, Septimus Jones, entered the room. At any rate, this friend was the nearest he had to his bosom. He was a man without friends in the true sense. There was no one who knew the innermost wishes of his heart, the secret desires of his soul. There was thus so many who can divulge none those secrets. And how can such a one have a friend who can advise him in what he shall do? Scarcely can the honest man have such a friend, but because it is so difficult for him to find a man who will believe in him. Augustus had no desire for such a friend, but he did desire someone who would do his bidding as though he were such a friend. He wanted a friend who would listen to his words and act as though they were the truth. Mr. Septimus Jones was the man he had chosen, but he did not in the least believe in Septimus Jones himself. What does the man say? Asked Septimus Jones. The man was the lawyer, of whom Augustus was now thinking at the very moment all manner of evil. Oh, damn him, said Augustus. With all my heart, yes, but what does he say? As you are to pay him for what he says, it's worthwhile listening to it. There was a tone in the voice of Septimus Jones which declared at once some diminution of his usual respect. So it sounded at least to Augustus. He was no longer the assured heir of Tretton, and in this way he was to be told the failure of his golden hopes. It would be odd, he thought, if he could not still hold the dominion over Septimus Jones. I am not at all sure that I shall listen to him or to you either. As for that, you can do as you like. Of course I can do as I like. Then he remembered that he must still use the man as a messenger, if in no other capacity. Of course he wants to compromise it. A lawyer always proposes a compromise. He cannot be beat that way, and it is safe for him. You had agreed to that. But what are the terms to be? That is the question. I made my offer, half and half. Nothing fairer could be imagined, unless, indeed, I choose to stand out for the whole property. But what does your brother say? He could not use his friend even as a messenger without telling him something of the truth. When I think of this injustice, I can hardly hold myself. He proposes to give me £25,000. £25,000 for everything? Everything, yes. What the devil do you suppose I mean? Now just listen to me. Then he told his tale as he thought it ought to be told. He recapitulated all the money he had spent on his brother's behalf and all that he had chose to say that he had spent. He painted in glowing colors the position in which he would have been put by the Nice marriage. He was both angry and pathetic about the creditors, and he tore his hair almost with vexation at the treatment to which he was subjected. I think I'd take the £25,000, said Jones. Never. I'd rather starve first. Well, that's about what you'll have you'll have to do if you ask me. There was again that tone of disappearing subjection. I'll be shot if I wouldn't take the money. Then there was a pause. Couldn't you do that and go to law with him afterwards? That's what your father would have done. Yes, but Augustus had to acknowledge that he was not as clever as his father. At last he gave Jones a commission. Jones was to see his brother and explain to him that before any question could be raised as the amount to be paid under the compromise, a sum of £10,000 must be handed to Augustus to reimburse him for the money out of pocket. Then Jones was to say, as out of his own head, that he thought that Augustus might probably accept £50,000 in lieu of £25,000. That would still leave the bulk of the property to Montjoy, although Montjoy must be aware of the great difficulties which would be thrown in his way by his father's conduct. But Jones had to come back the next day with an intimation that Montjoy had again gone abroad, leaving full authority to Mr. Barry. Jones was sent to Mr. Barry, but without effect. Mr. Barry would discuss the matter with the lawyer, or, if Augustus was so pleased, with himself, but he was sure that no good would be done by conversation with Mr. Jones. A month went on. 2 months went by. Nothing came of it. "It is no use you coming here, Mr. Scarborough," at last Mr. Barry said to him, with but scant courtesy. "We are perfectly sure of our ground. There is not a penny due to you, not a penny. If you will sign a certain documents, which I would advise you to do in the presence of your own lawyer, there will be £25,000 for you. You must excuse me if I say that I cannot see you again on the subject, unless you accept your brother's liberality." Which is exactly what it is. Montjoy doesn't have to pay Augustus anything. At this time, Augustus was very short of money, and, as is always the case, those to whom he owed anything became pressing in his readiness to pay them, as his readiness to pay them gradually receded. But to be spoken to by a lawyer, he, Scarborough of Tretton, as he had all but been, to be so addressed by a man whom he had regarded as old Gray's clerk, was bitter indeed. He had been so exalted by that Nice marriage, and had been lifted so high in the world, that he was now absolutely prostrate. He quarrelled with his lawyer, and he quarrelled also with Septimus Jones. There was no one with whom he could discuss the matter, or rather, no one who would discuss it with him on his own terms. So at last he accepted the money, and went daily into the city in order that he might turn it into more. What became of him in the city is hardly the province of this chronicle to tell. I think, so that's the last of Augustus Scarborough. He is finally driven to take a gift of money from his brother, and not 1,000 a year. He needs more than that. He takes the lump sum. I think there's a subtle little thing here that is worth noting. When Montjoy Scarborough's fate is sealed, when he is the true inheritor of Tretton Park, with all of its acres and its rising value, he is warned by his father and by his father's sister to put off gambling. Stop gambling, or it'll all go away. And he can't admit that he'll do it unless Florence Montjoy saves him. He can't admit that he'll stop. And we get the clear impression that he won't stop, and that all of it will go away. But notice the last part of this chapter. Augustus Scarborough gets £25,000. It's enough to live on for the rest of his life. But what does he do? He goes into the city every day to see if he can increase it. In other words, he's playing the stock markets. In other words, he's gambling. Just like his brother. He owes people money, and he's gambling with this money instead of treating it respectfully. So that's the last of Augustus Scarborough, a thorough heel. That leaves us only one final thing to conclude. So we will go to that chapter next, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.